How much glucose does the brain actually need per day? Is there a set amount?
So they usually do say that the brain needs about 120 grams of glucose per day,
Hmm.
but I'm sure a lot of your viewers are very educated in this. They know just because the brain requires glucose doesn't mean that we have to eat carbohydrates.
Mm.
The human body is very good at recycling and reusing, and we make glucose out of a lot of other things, including amino acids, including fatty acids, and and glycerol. So in order to provide the brain glucose, we don't necessarily have to eat pasta and rice and bread. Um, when when you transition your body to using a different fuel, I assume your viewers know about ketones. I'm not sure, but
Hmm. Yeah,
there's
well, they do.
other.
Yeah, they're quite
Okay,
smart
so
people.
if you go on a very low carb diet, when your body doesn't have enough carbohydrate coming in, your body's forced to transition to running on a different fuel. And the fuel it will run on is fat. And as a byproduct of a fat-based metabolism, we produce ketones, and
Mm.
ketones are an alternative energy source for the brain. And depending on how high you can get your ketone levels, ketones can provide up to like 60% of the brain's energy. Now that's very high. Most people won't get there, but most people 20 to 40%, you can provide a pretty significant amount of energy to your brain from ketones, and that reduces the amount of glucose that you
Mm.
need. I can't put an exact number on it, but you won't need 120 grams of glucose. You will need much less, and that glucose can be provided by other things in your diet besides carbohydrate.
Mm. Yeah, can you maybe give us some examples?
Of the foods or
Or like, how can the brain get the remaining parts of the glucose it needs other
oh
than?
sure, yeah. So when you're eating very, very little carbohydrate, or fasting or not eating anything, your body will make glucose from amino acids that come from protein, from glycerol, which is part of a triglyceride, the fat molecule. So that could come from either fat in your food, like, olive oil, eggs, bacon, cheese, or it could come from your own stored body fat. From the amino acids, again, that can come from protein in your food,
Hmm.
beef, pork, seafood, poultry, or from your own body proteins. And, if you're not eating enough, it could come from breaking down your muscle tissue, which we don't want,
Hmm.
breaking down your bones and your connective tissue, or it also can come from the recycling of old, worn out proteins that they'll just recycle those amino acids.
Mm. Yeah,
But
that's
there's really no risk of not having enough fuel to the brain, whether it's partially ketones and partially glucose. The body does very, very well at supplying the brain with energy.
would there be like any difference between converting protein into glucose versus, just getting the glucose from carbohydrates? Would it affect the brain in the same way? Is there any
Well,
difference?
that's a good question. I don't know that there is a difference. I mean, glucose is glucose once it's inside the brain,
Hmm.
but how the body produces it, one of the single biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is chronic hyperinsulinemia. When I said before that type 2 diabetics who take insulin injections have the highest risk for Alzheimer's, even people without diabetes, with no family history of Alzheimer's, with no genetic risk factors, independently of all those other risk factors, if you
Hmm.
have chronically high insulin, you are at greater risk for Alzheimer's disease in the future.
Mm.
And so the difference between getting glucose from a lot of dietary carbohydrate versus letting your body make exactly the amount of glucose it needs, is that your insulin is going to be low. In
Hmm.
one case, you'll have high insulin. In one case, you'll have lower insulin. And that's a very important issue when it comes to cognitive function. When you're tired and you don't have enough energy, what happens? You get clumsy, you make mistakes you don't normally make, you're not your same, your mood is different. So what do we think happens when the brain itself doesn't get enough energy? It's going to make mistakes, it's going to
Hmm.
get clumsy.
Hmm.
Alzheimer's disease really is a fuel crisis. It's an energy shortage in the brain. On
Mm.
an MRI, they can actually see that the volume of the person's brain has
Yeah.
shrunk. If you have chronically high insulin, you are at greater risk for Alzheimer's disease in the future.
Where's your duffel bag?